Real quick, wanted to jump in here before we start today's episode, number 50 of the No Room to Talk podcast. Bear with us. We had a little audio technical difficulties, but please bear with us. This is a really good interview. I think there's some good information out there to be heard. So with no further ado, let's go. Welcome to the No Room to Talk podcast. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Another episode of the No Room to Talk podcast. I am here today with a guest. Speaking with me is Tariq Fancy. Tariq used to be the former chief investment officer of sustainable investing at BlackRock. If you're not aware of BlackRock, BlackRock is one of the, if not the largest investment management companies on Wall Street. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Tariq.
Hey, nice to connect with you.
Absolutely. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm good.
All right. So what really got me is when you brought up I was reading over your bios and found out how you came out whistleblowing on this term called greenwashing. Like I said, you worked on Wall Street, which is, to me, the way I think about it, it's like the old Oliver Stone movie with Michael Douglas, a lot of like buy, sell, or the Boiler Room, just so crazy. Is investing really like that?
It depends on where you sit. I mean, it's a big industry, right? So there are people who invest long term. There's people who invest short term. There's people who, are buying or selling debt or equity. But in general, it doesn't look exactly like the movies, but the aggressiveness and the style do add up. I mean, it's the kind of folks who don't leave money on the table. You know what I mean? They're pretty competitive and they like to win.
Yeah, because like my view of it, it always looked like it was like the hip job to have if you were a New Yorker, you lived in New York. You wanted to wear the fancy suits, drive the nice cars, go to all the, up well-to-do restaurants and things like that. And, that's one of the things. Is that something that you always thought that you wanted to get into? It was like something that you had wanted to aspire to become in your future?
No, it wasn't actually. It kind of happened in some ways by accident. I feel like that happens for a lot of people the same way. I kind of had a passion around international development, actually, because my parents were born and raised in Kenya. I was born in Canada. I was the only member of my family born in Canada. Had a kind of view of the world where I'd seen the extremes of like wealth versus, the other end, people who have a lot less opportunity. And I wanted to work on and do something about that. And, I hit the end of undergrad and the banks show up to campus and they're particularly aggressive, I think, and effective if you don't know what you're going to do next. Like some people know they want to go to grad school or they want to do this or that. And in my case, I had my sights set on winning this one scholarship that I didn't win at the end of undergrad in the last round. I had no other plan, and the bank showed up, and they were, the pay is attractive for for that age. What you can get, it's really hard work, but honestly, a lot of the smart kids, kind of get sucked into it and it becomes a bit self-fulfilling, right? You kind of follow, the other people. So if you think all the smart kids are doing it, then you kind of get lured into it. And then eventually you get, the lifestyle starts to get to you and you start to enjoy parts of it.
So these firms, they actually start like looking at potential candidates while you guys are still in college pursuing careers. Not really, like you said, not really having an understanding of what you want to get into, but they kind of can see which students have the correct aptitude that would be good for what they do.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. In fact, it's before you graduate, they'll come on the campus and recruit for summer internships. So, I grew up in Toronto. I had never even spent any time in New York and did an internship at Merrill Lynch and gave me a taste of living in New York as part of a program, with a bunch of other people my age from different, other schools. And then eventually it kind of just becomes, you get these railroad tracks, right? That you kind of on those tracks. And, at that point in your life, people are trying to figure out what to do and they're not sure what the next thing is. And, there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety around it. And so when you get an offer to go on these train tracks that are pretty attractive and that seem like something a lot of people want, you kind of get on them, right? So you do the internship, and if you do well, they'll give you, a full-time offer, and then you go straight out of college and then end up, starting to build a career there.
So what's an internship like for someone coming in? Like, what would your title be just going in as an intern?
Usually it would be summer intern. I mean, if, there are all those interns who will try to make it something bigger, financial analyst or whatever. But in general, if you're just there for a few months over the summer, your role is mainly to be, to do a little bit of work here and there. And depending on the firm, a lot of it is kind of about, trying to feel you out, because if they've had you for the summer, 2 or 3 months, and the people really like you, they know they want to hire you by that point, right? Because it's kind of like a long interview. And so they know for sure, and then they go out of their way to try to recruit those people to join afterwards.
So, and this is something that I can, just thinking about is just making my head spin, like dealing with the amounts of money. Like when you made your first, I guess, deal going in, and it was like a giant, enormous amount of money. Was that kind of scary, that feeling of like being in control of somebody's finances like that?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it definitely is, right? I mean, luckily there are checks and balances. So the first time you're doing it, like you're just kind of looking in the window, it's kind of like a surgery room or something, right? Where there's like a glass and you get a bunch of student, trainee doctors and all watching, surgery happening. You're kind of on the outside and you're watching it and you're starting to get a sense for it. But you definitely do over time start to become almost, oblivious to the dollar sizes, because they vary quite a bit, right? To give you a sense, BlackRock, you had mentioned in the intro, actually BlackRock is now the world's largest asset manager and has around $9 trillion under management. So that $9 trillion is the largest asset manager in the world, and also I think the largest asset manager in history. So there's never been anyone that large. Obviously you could sit and try to calculate how much that is in so many different ways, but a lot of their products are investment products that are a lot of money, right? There's like billions and billions of dollars, but they're very low fee and structured to be, just really less about investing and more about just tracking the market. So they end up with big amounts of money. And it's funny because the deal, the fees that come back to the bank or to different players, they're linked to the dollar amount, but then, sometimes they're very high depending on what it is. And sometimes they're very low.
Yeah, it's just so crazy just watching like numbers move. Like there's no actual like, I'll give you said $1 million, then you take that $1 million and move it. It's just watching like the numbers tick. It's, to me, it's just really overwhelming. I can't even believe just seeing how somebody sits and it's like, okay, you're entrusting me in faith that what I'm going to do with this is apply it somewhere and create you more wealth. Like that is, I don't understand. I really don't see how you guys do it.
It's funny. But you're hitting on an important point, because it's precisely because you have that responsibility that inside the system, people have legal restrictions, right? So think of it this way. If you zoom out for a second, Wall Street seems like really, really daunting, right? Because it's like all this stuff going on, money moving around. At the end of the day, the simplest way to think about it is that Wall Street provides capital, right, throughout the economy, right? Money that people need to build a factory, to buy stuff, to do this, that, and the other. And if you think of the economy, right, the US economy is like a human being's body, then the money that's flowing through it is a bit like the blood that goes through the veins, right? And it's helping different parts of the body to function, right? Like, so that you can move your arms, you can move your legs, and that capital, that money flows through. And the simplest way to think about what it's really they're doing is Wall Street is kind of connecting the money of savers, right? People, whoever saves money, it doesn't, like if you and I have a checking account, then that's savings, right? And they're going to connect that to users of that capital, to productive uses of that capital, somebody who, is going to buy a new factory and build it and expand their operations. and then make some profit, and then hopefully, some of that profit comes back to the provider of the capital. And it happens throughout the economy. Like, if, again, you and I have a checking account, it may show whatever balance it shows and it's always there, but technically what the bank does is it takes a whole lot of people's checking accounts and it starts to lend out portions of that at a higher rate than they're paying you. And that's how they make their money, right? Because they're basically lending it out at a higher interest rate, and then they're hoping, obviously, that everybody doesn't ask for their money back at the same time. Otherwise, by definition, they won't have it because they've lent it all out. And that's what's called a run on the bank. And usually, that doesn't happen. And because people don't all ask for it at once. And even if they did, in theory, the government then would, like they did in 2008 in the financial crisis, come to support the banks, because you can't have banks failing. Otherwise, the whole economy kind of falls apart.
Right. Another one of the things that I just had like questions on, like, how are you like with the whole thing of corporations themselves? Having just, random guy look on things, it seems like a system that is almost built to eat itself, because you need to gain year over year. Like, from my understanding, if you were to just break even, you're losing. Would I be correct in that assumption?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, what it is everybody's competing, and they're all trying to grow, right? In the overall, right, the economy, everybody wants growth every year, right? GDP growth and so on. And that is going to be comprised of firms. Some will be winning, some will be losing. But in the aggregate, like if you add them all up, generally everybody's trying to grow, and the goal is that overall there's growth. And that creates a high degree of competition, which then matters for social causes and other things, because you have a whole bunch of corporations. They're all structured from the ground up to produce profit, right? They're going to tell you, that they're there to have social purpose and they're going to do great things for the world. And, maybe that's true also. Maybe they care about other things at the same time. But legally, they are focused on making money. That's the way they've been structured. And that's, the investors put money in, that's what they expect. And so if you think of all the corporations in the US economy, it's kind of like a competitive sport, right? Like competitive markets are like competitive sports, right? You have, a bunch of players and they're all competing to score points, right? And in capitalism, the points are profits, right? So you're competing to get profits. So it ends up being a really competitive marketplace, and they're all kind of, fighting it out, to produce a highly competitive game. And in the ideal scenario, that competition creates a lot of innovation, right? And a lot of productivity growth, and creates more jobs, and everyone benefits. In the worst instance, where it goes wrong is if sometimes they're competing in ways that are hurting society, right? So if they think that in order to increase their profits, they want to underpay people, or they want to pollute in a bunch of ways that they can get away with, then often that's what happens. And in a lot of cases, that's kind of what's happened in the last 10 or 20 years, right? A lot of competition, a lot of growth, but also a lot of negative side effects for society.
Right. The reason I bring that up, it kind of leads into the discussion that I wanted to talk to you about today with the greenwashing. Is like you said, it's a competition. In any competition, you're always trying to get a leg up on the next person. And like going out with ESG Investing, which stands for Environmental Social Governance Investing. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's right. Yeah.
And that goes for, I'm sure you see a lot of companies out there saying they're going green. They're adding, trying to shrink their carbon footprint. And that looks really appealing to a lot of, people now. They're looking into, climate change in the world, wanting to put their money into good causes. But me, myself, like I was very new to this whole, the term greenwashing, but as a skeptical person, I was kind of understanding of what it was before I actually heard the term. And it's just putting on a good face, just to try to get a leg up when what they're actually trying to do is really impossible to do.
It's pretty much it. I mean, there are things that they can do that would be good for the world. The problem is they're not doing them. And the reason they're not doing it usually is because it's not profitable, right? So if you go back to the sports analogy, let's imagine it's a game of basketball and you're on the court and you need to score points, right? And then someone says, hey, in the process of trying to score points, you're doing something that's harming the fans or, someone else. And they say, hey, that's not sportsmanlike. You should be more, sportsmanlike and play fair and play clean. In theory, you want to do that, but no ball players on the court, they all know that you don't get points for playing nice, right? At the end of the day, if, you have to do what you have to do to win. And if a player can get away with playing a bit dirty on the margins because it helps them score points and win games, they're going to keep doing it, right? Because it's either that or they're going to be on the bench, right? I mean, it's super competitive. And that's what's kind of happened with a lot of environmental and social issues. Right now, for companies, they make more money by doing what's not in the public interest, right? So, for example, we don't want them to burn as many fossil fuels because it releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and it creates, over the long term, or even now we're seeing, examples of it, irreversible climate damage and environmental damage. The problem is they make money by doing things that aren't good, by burning more oil, coal, and gas than we want. And so what they've generally been doing is saying, hey, don't worry, we want to do the right thing, and we care about the environment, this and the other. In reality, they're not changing nearly as fast as we need them to. And so they're kind of like basketball players. They're like, listen, don't worry, good sportsmanship is the answer. We're going to be good sportsmen like from now on. But the reality is that you look underneath, and that's what I did. I was looking at all the data across the biggest asset manager in the world, and it became pretty clear to me that players are playing dirty because it wins. And as long as those loopholes still exist where they can play dirty and do things that are bad for society because they make some short-term profit, they're just going to keep doing it. And that creates kind of a problem for society in terms of how we fix it.
Right. And I can only imagine that was a pretty difficult place for you to be in. I mean, you had, like I said, you were the chief investment officer of sustainable investing at BlackRock. I mean, which that's a pretty prestigious job, and I'm pretty sure it took a lot of doing to put yourself in that position, but able to, instead of just turn a blind eye to it, you pointed it out. Like, what kind of backlash did you receive? Like, was this something that you brought up to your peers while you were there at BlackRock, or was it something that you just knew if you spoke on it would definitely get you, like blackballed?
It kind of, they haven't reacted terribly to it. I think they understand that there's an argument in the public interest and a debate that needs to happen in a democracy, but obviously they don't love that I'm coming out and saying it. But for me, it was kind of natural, right? Because I spent a bunch of time in finance. I left in 2013. And I left actually because I wanted to do something with a bit more of a social purpose. So I created a tech nonprofit that I now run called Rumie. It's Rumie. And the idea behind Rumie is that we just, we make learning easy, fast, and simple. Like, the goal is to make it as fun as social media, right? So we use something called micro learning, where you could, if you go to rumie.org, it's all open and free. It's kind of like a Wikipedia of micro learning. You can just learn in 5-minute snippets. And so I'd actually left already to do that, right? I left all the financial world and the financial bottom line, and I said, actually, I want to dedicate myself to building a social bottom line. And that's kind of what got me lured back into BlackRock, because they said, well, hey, we're doing sustainable investing or ESG investing or whatever. And, we're trying to make profit and do good stuff for the world at the same time. And they said, look, you're someone who's from our world. You understand the investing piece. You also now understand the social piece, because I, founded and created and running a nonprofit. And that's kind of what led me back in there, right? To try to do both at the same time. And then when I was there, I kind of started to realize that there wasn't, a lot of real social impact being created out of this. It just looked kind of like the stuff I've seen Wall Street do throughout my career, where, they'll find ways to make money, but there's no one really actually policing whether any of this is doing any good for the world, or if it's just kind of hollow marketing that's wasting valuable time. And so, it's only after I left, I started thinking to myself, you know what, like, I started realizing, to be honest, more and more that it wasn't even, not helping the world. It was actively harmful, right? Because on a whole bunch of social causes, we have time's running out on inequality, whether it's economic inequality or wealth inequality or racial inequality or environmental damage or, a whole bunch of issues that, a lot of progressives care about, and not a lot of progress is being made. And, time is burning away, right? I mean, we're running out of time on these things. And that's why I kind of looked at it and I said, this stuff isn't even just harmless. It's actually duping the public into believing that Wall Street's doing something to help, when in fact, all they're doing, from what I could see, was, spinning a yarn about how the system is changing, even though it's not, and then selling a bunch of like high fee products to people that, sort of claim to make the world a better place, when in reality, underneath the hood, I knew that, there was no evidence of that. So, I think it got a little bit of a backlash, but, I don't, pardon my French, I don't really give a shit, because, the reality is, I look at all the heroes that I grew up, watching, and people who have inspired me. And every single time they spoke truth to power when there was a moment to do it, and they thought that they had an ability to shift a debate. And I had seen inside the middle of the machine, and had seen very clearly what the public thought was happening and what I observed was actually happening. This is not just BlackRock, it's across the entire industry. There was a massive disconnect, and it was burning valuable time. And I thought to myself, well, listen, this is something that, the world needs to know about, and we need to have a debate about it, because we can't waste time on stuff like this.
Right. Now I remember you were saying there are actually like checks and balances for the actual trading, but for the misrepresentation of what these companies are actually doing, what are their checks and balances? Now, does this need like government intervention to actually go in with more stringent reviewing of data that these companies are giving out, or are they even putting any data out that can actually be researched so you can actually see what is going on inside these companies? Are they truly taking the steps to go green? Are they actually living up to what they're saying?
Well, you asked the right question, because actually, the reality is that you need some data and understanding of what they're doing. Generally speaking, companies don't disclose a lot, right? Because, they're going to say, oh, it's expensive and it's a lot of work, and why does anyone need this information? So they don't have to release information unless it's required of them by government. So, for example, if you're a publicly traded company and people can buy your shares, you have to file your financials that are audited so people can look at them and understand them. But beyond a certain set of things that are required of them, they don't have to report anything else if they don't want to, right? They're private companies, and they could, they decide not to, they don't have to. And so really, what the only thing that'll change the situation now is the government going in and changing things. And I would view it as being, there's sometimes confusion about what government does, right? Government is a provider, right? So if you go get a vaccine or a COVID test or a this or that, they're building roads and schools and so on. But government also plays a role as a regulator. And as a regulator, it's pretty much like a referee in sports, right? So it says, wait a second, like in basketball, if I slap someone in the face and then go do a layup past them, like clearly I'm going to call it a foul. If there's no referee, it'll work, because I could just hit someone and go score. But obviously there's a referee, and there's rules that are meant to stop that kind of thing, because it's in no one's interest. And the competitive markets are the exact same, right? The government plays the role of regulator. It sets out a bunch of conditions that say, here's, what's intellectual property, right? What's the protection like? How long do you get IP rights? There are rights around private property and pollution, taxes, other things. And all of those are kind of the rules of the game. And I think what's happened in the US, from the best I can tell, is that since the 1980s, in particular under the Reagan era, there was the shift in mentality where people started to believe that, like, quote unquote, free markets solve all problems. So you don't need government to do anything. And that philosophy has been espoused by Republicans, but also largely by Democrats. And so you don't really have, you only have a lot of different viewpoints, right? If both parties are kind of moving in that direction in the last 30, 40 years. And so as a result, you have, if people believe you don't need, government to do anything, it's kind of like a sports game where people say, well, you don't need referees, right? Like people will self-referee. Obviously, past a certain point, that doesn't work anymore. And so you hear a lot of people saying a lot of nonsense like, oh, well, the free market will solve it. And, you stop and think, wait a second, there is no such thing as a free market. Like there are rules in every single sport. There's rules in every single market, in every single business, right? You have rules around, how you operate. And those rules are just long overdue. They need to be changed. And if they change effectively, I think that you could see policy changes that reduce inequality, they reduce environmental damage and so on, but that hasn't really been happening. And the dominant discourse that's coming out of business and Wall Street is like, don't worry, you can trust us, which is, again, like a bunch of dirty players who have been winning games by playing dirty for 20 years, basically saying, no. Who needs a referee, right? Like, just don't worry, good sportsmanship is the answer, even though it obviously isn't working.
Right. And as one of the things that stood out that you just said is, yes, these are private companies, but when you look at the amount of influence these companies actually hold, it's hard to really view them as as these like single entities when they have their their hands in just about every front in the financial world. And I'm pretty sure that if there were to be government intervention, there would be heavy pushback from the people who head these companies up. Would you say?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the fundamental challenge is that some of these people have never been elected, and yet they have extraordinary power, right? I mean, you might argue that Mark Zuckerberg has a level of influence that for a private citizen is, I wouldn't say I don't know if it's unprecedented in democracy, but it's very, very rare that someone like that who's operating under no checks and balances and can kind of do whatever they want. None of us have voted, to make him the CEO of Facebook or whatever, but he has a ton of influence and power. So does Jeff Bezos. So does, all of these other CEOs. And the problem is that they are running systems where they're just trying to squeeze out as much profit as they can. And that system is always going to rebel against any attempt to regulate it, right? So whether those individuals or the companies that they run, you're absolutely right. There's going to be a giant backlash. And the biggest challenge is that I think it was 2010, in the US, there was this Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, which effectively allowed money in politics on a level that hadn't been seen before, right? So people could just throw money in and, a lot of people would say arguably, sort of bribe people and politicians to do certain things. And the money isn't really traceable and it's, hard to know where it's coming from. And that runs into a really big problem, right? Because if you have a bunch of people who are very, very powerful and wealthy, and you finally say, hey, it's time to change that and make the system more fair. Well, the people who have all the money now have, frankly, also all of the tools to prevent you from changing it, right? And so it puts a really high burden on, building a grassroots kind of citizens movement that, really pushes through the political system to create the kind of change that is in the interest of the majority of Americans, but is not going to happen as long as a minority have excessive influence and, don't want to see that go away.
Right. And I'm pretty sure the sentiment that you would probably hear the most is, this is capitalism. Like, this is America. This is how America runs. But I think in the long run, the problem that seems to keep turning its face up is the fact that it is a very competitive. So like you said, there's winners and losers, but in this arena, the losers, I mean, it can be catastrophic for people. And it only makes it beneficial, like you said, to play these games, to try to pull the wool over the buying public's eyes to the things that they're doing. And it really doesn't seem like there's any way out of it, because like you said, some of these people, these CEOs, do have political sway. And I'm pretty sure when it comes to voting time, we may say, oh, we need to make changes, but will those changes actually come down?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, here's two interesting data points, right? Number one, the average length of time a CEO is in their position as a CEO of a company is the shortest that it's been in decades. So the average the CEO tenure, they call it, is like 5 years. I think it's just under 5 years now. So it's they're not there for very long. Their pay is the highest it's been in decades, right? The average CEO gets paid 320 times the average industry worker, right? So really what it means is that they show up, they aren't there for very long, they get paid an enormous amount of money. And in the end, they could make in 5 years what they might have made in the past in 10 or 15 years. That creates a problem for society because they're very incentivized towards short term, right? All they really care about then is can I make money in the next few years? They don't really care that much about 20 years out because they're not going to be the CEO anymore, and they've already retired. So that's where you end up with an issue because a lot of the social challenges around inequality and climate change are long-term ones, right? They're ones that they've been festering for 20 years. We haven't done anything. Every time you ask people about it, it's a longer term thing, and they're sort of they're just focused on the next few years. And so what ends up happening is that for a lot of companies, it's actually cheaper to market yourself as being green, right? Which is greenwashing, effectively. Come out with a bunch of marketing, show all the good stuff you're doing for the world, but behind the scenes, you keep the machine running the same way because all you really want to do in some sense is fend off public pressure, right? But you don't want to make the big changes that will actually change the system because that'll take 10 plus years, 20 plus years. You're out by then. So they're only focused on what makes them money in some form in the next 5 years. And I don't mean all CEOs. I mean obviously there's a ton of good ones and people who mean well, but at a systemic level, right? That's sort of how the machine works. And I actually, on one point, I'd say I don't think it's capitalism. I'm a capitalist, right? I have an MBA. I was a former banker. I think capitalism can produce great outcomes for people, but the fallacy is that people believe there's only one version of capitalism. In fact, it's like basketball, right? You could change the rules of the game and you'll get different outcomes, right? If you want less 3-pointers, you move the 3-point line back, and you'll get people hitting a lot less threes, right? But whatever the rules are, you can move them around. And if you look around the world today, you'll look at Sweden, right? Sweden's a capitalist country, and yet they have way better, more opportunities for people. Public education is a lot better funded. There are opportunities for people at every rung of the ladder to lift themselves up. And you don't really see that happening in the U.S. to a large extent. And part of the problem is that the U.S. itself has lost its own roots, right? If you think of the post-World War II period, 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the U.S. had less inequality, right? It had a more inclusive economy. Like if you remember, I'm old enough to remember the show called The Wonder Years,
yeah,
with that guy Fred Savage. It was like the American dream, right? It's like people are they're all middle class, they can make it up. Environmental protection was better too, right? Richard Nixon was president when the U.S. created the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. So you had a period there where capitalism was working the way it was meant to work, and it was lifting everybody up. And it was a system that worked, right? It was in the public interest. That's nothing like what exists today, right? Where there's massive levels of inequality, massive levels of environmental damage, and there's a whole bunch of things that just don't look anything like the period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And instead of fixing the system, which really does have to come through government, right, kind of playing the role as referee, you're instead sort of seeing government historically having sat back and done nothing. Obviously, in the Trump era, that was almost inevitable because it seemed like he was trying to break everything in sight. So you don't get much coming out of that, and you have a bunch of businesses who should be saying, listen, we need to fix systemic problems and we need government to lead the way because you're elected and you have all the tools to set laws and do everything. And instead of doing that, they're kind of like, oh no, we've got this, we're going to solve it all, which, again, I saw inside, I'm like, that's nothing is getting done beyond a bunch of marketing for the most part.
Now, are there such as yourself, CEOs out there who are starting companies, and it seems to be more on the upstarts and the smaller guys that are actually trying to go out there and shrink their carbon footprint, use green renewable sources of energy. That must infuriate them, and then wonder if unless they can truly stick to their morals and their conviction, make them want to say why am I even doing this?
You're 100% right. If you think, let's go back. I love using sports analogies. If you go back to the basketball analogy, it's kind of like Steph Curry, right? Imagine, you have a bunch of players who are, playing dirty and fouling and cheating and then wins games. You're going to have a few players who are doing the right thing, right? A bunch of players doing the right thing. And it's most frustrating for them because, they're playing clean, they're winning the right way, but you don't really get the relative advantage of that unless the referee is penalizing the dirty players, right? And that's exactly what you have happening now. In the economy, there are a lot of good companies that, I do work through Rumie with a company called Eco ATM. It's they basically have kiosks in Kroger's and Walmart's, and they have a website, and you can basically sell them your old smartphone, and they'll give you a price, and they'll send you a mailer, or you drop it in one of their kiosks, and they'll resell that device then later to someone, let's say in a third world country, or someone, whoever else needs it. And it's a great business model because you can get rid of that old cell phone sitting in your drawer that you're probably not going to ever use again. And if that the company doubles in size, it's good for the world, right? Because they're just recycling smartphones and they're keeping them out of landfill. That's a great company. We want that company to double in size. And there's a bunch of other companies like that, but the problem is they don't, unless you have a set of rules that actually encourages clean play, encourages recycling, encourages paying your workers well, and so on. You have a bunch of CEOs exactly like you suggested. Like, they're trying to do the right thing, right? They're trying to reduce their carbon footprint, trying to do this, that, and the other. But eventually, it costs them money. It's hard to do it if the system around you is rewarding bad behavior, because eventually you get into trouble with your own investors, right? Because they're sort of like, why is our stock price lower than the competitors? And it may be because the competitors are doing a bunch of things that are not, good for society. But, again, if you're playing a sport and dirty play wins games, until the referees show up and do their job, you're kind of in a bit of a bind.
So do you have any hope for the future? Do you feel that things will progress in the right direction, or do you think we are just doomed to repeat this cycle?
I actually have some optimism because I honestly think that the COVID crisis, there's two ways it goes. One is that everybody looks at it and they say, well, it's done, and then everyone goes back to normal, which is kind of starting to happen a little bit. The other way is that people look at it and they say, hey, wait a second, for certain challenges, we need, those challenges are systemic. And if you have a systemic challenge that works across the board, then you need a solution provided by government. And COVID-19 was that, right? I mean, it hit, and then everyone realized you couldn't just kind of sit back and leave it to the free market, right? The government had to flatten the infections curve by closing places, closing schools, and trying to keep infections under control, with one hand, while they were kind of quickly kind of accelerating vaccines on the other hand to get us out of this mess, right? Effectively, with climate change, same thing, right? You need to flatten the greenhouse gas emissions curve, right? Same thing. Science telling us you got to flatten the curve. We have to reduce emissions, and at the same time, we need to build a whole bunch of new technologies that are far more energy efficient, so that we don't, end up in a bad spot. That inequality, a whole bunch of other things. There are a bunch. There's no shortage of ideas, right, from experts and economists on how to do it. What's been lacking is the political will, right? And I think that is the one thing that I'm guardedly optimistic that coming out of the pandemic, there's a chance that people will look and realize that, a systemic problem, whether it's a global pandemic, climate change, an alien invasion, whatever it is, you want the government leading the way, right? You don't want the CEO of Walgreens standing up to fight the aliens. At some point you have a government for a reason. And my hope is that if people start to believe again, and it's been, since the 80s that this sort of bankrupt thesis that the free market will do everything has existed. People realize that that's ridiculous, and we need the government to go in and do their job. And there are some politicians who are pushing for that. I think the more that they are empowered in that direction, the more that there's a chance that this decade we could, this decade pretty much make or break on climate change. So, I'm optimistic, but it's 2021, so let's see what happens.
Yeah, and one more thing, we're running a little long. One more thing I definitely wanted to get into is you said you left Wall Street and you said you felt like you wanted to do something that was beneficial, to the world, something that fed your soul more than fed your pockets. And you went out and you started this company. And what led you to this new endeavor that you wanted to take on?
What happened was I went to business school in '08. I did an MBA, and I decided to leave. I was working in New York, and then I decided to take a year off, and I went and did it in Europe. And as I was doing this MBA, and I became really close friends with this guy from Holland, and he and I became best friends, and we were roommates for the second half of the program. And one of the things that really, that we really connected on was that he and I had both worked in finance, right? He had been an investment banker, and we both said that we wanted to do something that, we cared about a lot of social things. We were probably meant to be sort of activists or working on social stuff here or there, and then got sucked into finance. And so we both kept saying we're going to do something good for the world. And then we graduated with MBAs, and then we went right back into finance because, they hoovered us back in. And that all changed a few years after we graduated because he was diagnosed all of a sudden with stage 4 melanoma, stage 4 cancer. And, it's one of those things where if you have a friend and they go, and you've bonded, you're super close, but then they go through this jarring event, often you live that through them. And for me, I watched, him fight stage 4 cancer for 2.5 years. This is a guy who was one of my close friends at business school. We were roommates. We're the same age. And he was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Dutch guy. And then he actually went to Kenya and created a charity around education there. Again, Kenya is where my parents were born and raised, at family roots. And so I was involved, helping him think through it. And when he passed, I just looked at it and I said, you know what? The only difference between me and him, right? I was standing at his grave. I was standing 6 feet above, and he was buried 6 feet below. And the only thing that mattered and separated us was luck, right? I mean, there's no way about it. I've known a lot of people were lucky and a lot of people were unlucky. And I felt like coming out of that, I had a moral obligation because I had this idea for Rumie. I love technology. I think it can, Rumie is now being used in over 170 countries. In our early days, we were doing stuff in Liberia during the Ebola pandemic, with Syrian refugees in the Middle East. We actually started doing stuff internationally before then building it more and more for people in North America. But the idea was there, and I just needed something to push me off the edge of the diving board. And when my friend passed, I looked and I realized, I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to do something like this and help people who have been unlucky. And that was it. And then I just went into it and, didn't look back.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's really incredible how you're not really looking for it, life will push you in the direction that you were supposed to go in. And the passing of your friend, your schoolmate, was that little kick that you needed. And that's amazing because especially giving education to those who do not have the ability to get formal education, as many others do around the world, is really important because for one thing people they take for granted is education is key. Education is power. The ability to read and write, just those two tools alone can take you almost anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, they let you realize your potential, right? Everybody has innate potential and creativity and passion. And I think the biggest difference I'm seeing, and I think it's getting worse in rich countries in recent years, is that if you come from a hard up community or a difficult family situation, or you don't have you don't get the opportunities that the kids in rich communities do, and it's a waste. It's unfair at an individual level, right? And it's terrible at a societal level, because if you want to build the best economy that you possibly can, you have to realize that there's a girl in Newark who could be the next Steve Jobs and could create an enormous enterprise that employs all these Americans and does all these great things. But it's only going to happen if she gets a chance to, realize her potential. And so many people don't today. And that's something we got to work on.
Yeah, that's really a big thing. One of the things I would quote from my mother, no one ever really knows what they can do until someone tells them that you can. In a lot of places, people aren't told that. It may sound shocking to some people, but some people don't get that. Some people don't hear that they have the ability to change the world if they want, and that's really inspiring what you are doing, because what you are doing is giving young people the opportunity to reach their potential, to know that they even have potential to reach for more, and to do something to get them out of their circumstance. I think that's really inspiring what you're doing.
Thanks, I appreciate it. And if you get a chance, check out Rumie.org. You'll see we surveyed kids recently, and nearly 90% of them said that it reminds them of and replaces social media time. This was the best data I've ever seen, because if people use a lot of social media over time, it hurts your mental health and so on. And so, we recommend, try diet, right? Every now and then do a couple of micro courses. They're all open and free. They're all entertaining. They've got, we use memes and GIFs and other things to keep it really engaging and fun. And, you could spend a few minutes on your phone and learn something, right? There's the stuff on mental health, there's job skills, but there's a lot on there. And our goal is just to democratize it, right? Make it free and available to anyone, anywhere.
Right. If you would, could you go in a little bit about the technology of like how you're using these web-based and the internet to teach kids? Because like you said, every kid, like my niece, I remember when she was just 7, she was already, operating an iPhone. So these devices, which can be a problem, they're very intuitive, and I think that's an awesome jumping on point to try to grab kids.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, honestly, when we started doing stuff around the world some years ago, when I first started Rumie, we found that people in communities that had never seen technology before, like they figured out how to use a tablet and smartphones, especially. I don't know if like a computer with a keyboard and a mouse, maybe not, but a touch screen is really, really intuitive. And so the way it works is that we basically said, well, the most recent research that came out in the last few years shows that microlearning, which is like if you learn, 5-minute snippets at a time, it actually creates better learning outcomes. So people actually learn better in general doing it that way. But the second thing we found that was kind of cool was that if we could make a micro course, which we call byte, if we could make a byte 5 or 6 minutes and mobile first, so it's like really intended and designed for like a smartphone, then we wouldn't actually be competing with any other education alternative, right? Like, because Coursera or Khan Academy, there's a bunch of great things online, but like you can't do it in 5 minutes on your phone, like a full-on end-to-end sort of learn a concept. But by doing that, we actually found that we were competing against, Instagram, because the average time someone spends on Instagram is 6 minutes. That doesn't sound like a lot of time until you look at the overall data and you realize that people spend like on average 2.5 hours a day or 3 hours a day on that stuff, right? And so our view is that these companies are getting people 5 minutes at a time, 5 minutes at a time. It really adds up, right? Because it's 5 minutes when you're, waiting for the bus, or you're in between meetings, or you're, whatever it is, you're just trying to kill time. And if you could try microlearning in that time, then then you actually get some real benefit to yourself out of it. Instead of the same old social media stuff that, I kind of find a bit depressing after a while, because everyone's presenting like not the life they have, but like, the one they want everyone to believe they have.
Yeah, it's one of the things I really harp on is the fact that too many people give too much of themselves to their Instagram, their Facebook feeds, because it's only snapshots of perceived, reality. It's not the whole story. You don't know what they were doing 20 minutes before. You don't know what they're doing 20 minutes after. It's just that moment. And a lot of people get lost in that and try to chase that dragon, but it's unattainable. So the most part, I would say if you're going to use that time, why not use something like Rumie and gain something from it?
Yeah, exactly. You'll build yourself over time rather than chasing an unattainable goal. Because you're right. I mean, honestly, with social media, it's like I've never seen anyone show a photo of themselves looking ugly or sitting on the toilet. You know what I mean? But I feel like they spend a lot of time. That's part of their life too, right? So it's like, you always get these snippets that are like really, really tailored. And I even, for friends, I'll see them doing it and they'll get the perfect shot and then they'll post it like it's what they're doing. I catch myself doing it. And then after a while, I'm like, I feel like I'm on a treadmill. You know what I mean? It's like a hamster. You're just running forever. You
Oh
can't
no,
win.
we're all guilty of it. We're all, you know,
It's true. It's true. It's true. We all do it. I complain about it, but then I'm like, well, let me go load Instagram and see what's going on. Whatever.
absolutely. It's
You
like
got to
one of
balance it.
it seems to be like one of the first things I do is like, oh, how many likes did I get? Or let's see, you got a new follower. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, that's Tariq, this has really been a very informative conversation I've had, and thank you so much for spending your time with my listeners today. Um, is there any other thing you want to get out there, let people know about what you're doing, or perhaps something that you're perhaps cooking up, ready to add to Rumie, or maybe even branch off into something else?
I think the biggest thing is that we're going to start using the micro learning technology to help people understand how to change the system. Because the biggest challenge of changing our economic system is that you need people to understand in simplified form how it works, right? And once you understand how the system works, then you know what levers you can pull to create the kind of social change we want. And the one thing I found was that it's hard for people to understand how the system works because it's really complex. So what we are doing at Rumie is we're starting to create micro learning around helping people understand the system, right? Like 5 minutes, how does the investment industry work? 5-6 minutes, what is ESG? What is sustainable investing? How do different pieces work? So we're going to start doing that more and more over the summer. So I'd encourage people to follow us on social media. It's Rumie Learn, or I'm on social media. I'm so fancy is my name because my last name's Fancy, and fancy and so fancy we're taking, so I'm so fancy. And we'll share more stuff on there. And again, all the stuff at Rumie is open and free, so it's kind of like a Wikipedia for free micro learning. And that's the one thing I'd say, people try to follow and check it out, because we'll start to share more stuff specifically around those topics around building a better society also, so that people, the more we all can share and understand that, the more chance we have of like fixing the problems.
Good stuff. Well, thank you, Tariq. Again, this has been a very informative conversation that I've had. I've learned a lot. That's why I love having these conversations with people out here in the real world doing real things, inspiring change. And what you're doing, sir, is definitely inspiring people.
Well, listen, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed the chat.
Absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been your host again, Shaman, with Tariq Fancy. If you want to get in touch with him, I will have all of his contacts will be attached in the description. For more, go to rumie.org and check these guys out. Micro learning, it's the next big thing. You should really look into it. Tariq, thank you again.
Thanks, Shaman. It was great. Great chatting.
All right. And with that, we're out, ladies and gentlemen. Catch you on the next one.